We could see in the sand, Tom loves Sally, written in the sand. I think overwhelming, the natural response should not be, well, that just formed by the waves. It just made these lines and all connected to create just accident. And
the sand was having a creative afternoon.
Yeah.
wanted to make some letters.
So let's say you strike up that conversation with, whether it be a coworker or your neighbor. You actually do get to discuss, you get to talk about your faith, and they get to talk about theirs, and they don't believe what you believe in. And they ask you, well, what is the greatest evidence that you have that you believe God exists? I guess we would assume that this person would be an atheist or even agnostic. But what would be that greatest? Tell me, what's your greatest evidence that you even believe in a God, that a God exists, let alone which God? But yeah, what would you say to them? What would be your greatest piece of evidence?
Well, I wouldn't say it's just one piece. It's probably several.
Yeah, but they want your greatest, your best shot. I know there's quite a few pieces, but if you had,
well, if we're getting, and especially these days, people like to go scientific. So I would say, well, I guess you could say scientific or physics, or I would just say on the basis of the Big Bang alone, that it proves God's existence, because, the Big Bang Theory all started with a Big Bang. It talks about how there's an explosion, and that's how, the universe came about. But something doesn't come from nothing, right? Something caused the uncaused cause, basically. There had to have been divine intervention for the universe to come into being, because you can't create something out of nothing. That doesn't happen.
So yeah, because you're saying we can just look around, we see lights, we see cameras, we see this table, these chairs. There was a designer.
And because if we're talking about the formation of the universe, there would have been, there was no world, there was no mankind, there was nothing. Jesus, when the Bible says that God was there before the foundation of the world, he was the hand that caused the universe to be brought into being. There is no other explanation. You can't create something out of nothing. My phone wasn't created out of nothing. It didn't just poof appear.
The pieces just didn't all connect.
Yeah, it didn't just come together like that. That's my first piece, would be that. But the other piece would be order and design. This world, it's in a fallen state, but everything that God created was meant for perfection. I mean, everything in our world flows in symmetry. Mother Nature flows in symmetry. We have 4 seasons. We have the perfect balance of oxygen to nitrogen and hydrogen in our atmosphere, so that we don't all choke and die. An apple grows on a tree. An apple falls to the ground 100 times out of 100. The apple doesn't go up or sideways or 5,000 miles to the east and blows through a wall.
Tornadoes do happen.
Yeah, they do.
That would be cool though, if an apple put a hole in the wall
and
falling off a tree.
And I'm not gonna speculate, because we haven't gone that far. But as far as I'm aware, there is no other planet in the universe like ours that sustains life like ours. Everything in our world, just take Mother Nature alone. Mother Nature takes care of itself. The systems in the world, our air pressure systems, moisture, our seasons, our heating and cooling, and our atmosphere being protected from solar radiation from the sun that would burn us up like meatballs if the ozone layer just went to pot. We started to make it go to pot in the 70s with that aerosol crap above Antarctica. I forget what the name of the chemical was, but we actually punched a hole in the ozone layer. That was us, right? So those would be 2 scientific examples. My other one would obviously be the gospel. Would be the 4 gospels, because it's eyewitness account testimony as to the life and times of Christ, who is God. Those would kind of be my big three.
Tom, what would be your greatest, if you only had one piece, I know there can be multiple, but what would be, if you had one piece of evidence, what would be your greatest piece of evidence that you could share with someone that this points to that God does exist?
I don't really have one.
Okay.
I will say something that I have told to people, though, is so you have two options in front of you. God exists or God doesn't exist. Okay, so what are you going to do? Well, if you believe that God doesn't exist and God doesn't exist, nothing happens. If you believe that God does exist and God doesn't exist, nothing happens. If you believe that God does exist and that God does exist, well, assuming you are believing in what the actual God wants, you're fine. If you believe that God doesn't exist and God does exist, well, then you're in trouble. So to me, if you look at it, it's just like, if there is no God, then what I believe in my value system doesn't matter. But my value system is telling me, or in that case, what my value is telling me is it is a value system that has been developed over a certain length of time that tells me how I am supposed to live my life in such a way that I can live with other people and do so very well, like it would be harmonious. Because if God doesn't exist, then all religion is trying to do is trying to get us to live in a way that we can get along with each other. But if you actually want like a scientific version of, well, does God exist or not, is
Doesn't even have to be scientific.
Well, is a question, is through all the different, animals in the world and all the other different things, why are humans the only ones that have done what they have done? Why? Because we know that dolphins, very smart animals. Chimps aren't necessarily dumb animals. There are so many different animals out there that if we actually look at their potential for intelligence, because that's one thing that some people say, oh, it's just our intelligence. Well, it's like, if you look at it, dolphins can be considered on average smarter than humans, so that doesn't work. But it's just like, you look at it, it's just like, why, either how is it that humans are the only species that is intelligent, or, I don't know. I kind of lose it there, but it's just like the fact that humans are kind of the sole ones that are intelligent. Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, you'd think that there'd be more animals that would be trying to get to where we are because we've kind of taken over the world. So you'd want more animals to get there. So does that mean we've killed them all off? Or just, are we unique in some way? And if we are unique in some way, that there's nothing in nature that makes it seem like that should be possible.
Well, it's interesting because you say you don't really have any evidence, but kind of indirectly you gave evidence. I think you're kind of going with a mash of intelligent design and a little bit of the moral argument a little bit with both. You kind of indirectly did give some evidence.
He gave an answer.
Yeah.
I have a quote I want to read, and
sure.
feel free to give feedback on it. Not entirely related to what Tom is saying, but I've always really loved this one. It's by Blaise Pascal, and he says, "Belief is a wise wager. Granted that faith cannot be proved, what harm will it come to you if you gamble on its truth and it proves false? If you gain all. If you lose nothing. wager then, without hesitation, that he exists.
Yeah, and that was a little bit what Tom was referring to.
But it's kind of the truth. I mean, if let's say Jesus is not God, and Jesus is just indeed was a human teacher, and I spent my life following his tenets and believing in him and living an amazing life on this earth, contributing to loving my neighbor and making a difference in the world. That is not a waste of my life. If there is no God and I die, that is not a waste of my life.
Yeah.
And if all we have waiting for us is the fertilizer pit, if you lived a life dedicated to improving and being selfless and loving your neighbor and doing all those awesome things that Jesus says in the Bible, you haven't lost anything.
Well, I would say to Blaise,
right? Because if you would just have the fertilizer pit,
I would say to Blaise Pascal, you're not really providing evidence with that statement, but you are providing a very logical conclusion. Like, this makes the most sense. And what you're saying, like, if this is not evidence, but if I was told that there's this place called hell and it exists and it's eternal, there's this potential possibility then that I could be wrong. And to think that if I'm wrong, I'm going to hell. But if I'm right, I'm going to the fertilizer pit. So Blaise, like, a great quote. It's been a very well-known quote from Blaise. Given the two options, if those are the only two, which logically makes the most sense? Yeah. Not really evidence, but in some ways a great critical thinking piece.
Well, I guess one thing that you could possibly look at, kind of in that vein, that might be considered evidence, is that if you go through cultures and you have different cultures throughout history, and then you take them together and you kind of compare them, at least in their belief systems, and the fact that there are certain levels of commonality between each thing, that's despite geographic location, that's despite cultural norms, and it's the belief systems that these countries or these places have had over an extended period of time, that, you're looking that these things have believed and these things have been taught for hundreds or thousands of years. And then it's just like, well, hold on. How often is something like a paradise talked about, and that we are striving to be a paradise? It's like, either you're looking at that and you're looking at it and you see that in ancient times people realized that their lives were so hard and that it was always better to look at something further into, like, okay, this is what we are striving for. This is, if we do these things here, if we can overcome the challenges that we are presented here, that we have something better coming for us. Well, that's one thing, but it's also, how much is there the potential? Because as we're going back, it's, at least in the Bible, it says that gazing upon nature reveals the magnificence of God. And it's like, yeah, there are so many cultures that look at the magnificence and, that is what we are, going to worship and all this other stuff. If there is something there that shows divinity.
So to nutshell it, we're back to order and design.
Yeah. Well, the magnificence of the world that we are in.
It's interesting because early on, I love the moral argument, and we talked about that earlier, objective morality. It's such an airtight argument, and it still can very well be the greatest piece of evidence in some regards. But now I'm kind of shifted now to, which you guys have actually both kind of pointed to indirectly. It is the fine-tuning argument, which is intelligent design. Just, I think why I love it more and more, I'm more fascinated about it, is because it is a very practical argument that seems to be a little bit more, when you bring it to its logical conclusion, you have to wrestle with origin and destiny, yeah, you just look at how the world has been constructed in this universe, and just the tiniest little degree that the gravitational force is moved, this world's in utter chaos, one way or the other.
Yeah, like imagine if all our houses and every all just started floating 50,000 feet in the air. It'd be absolute chaos.
Yeah, there's just
no gravity, right?
There's so many intangibles going on. Like if we were even just a little bit closer to the sun, like we're fried.
We're a meatball.
We're done.
We're a one singed meatball.
Yeah, or if we're tiniest away from the sun, like we're like deep freeze.
That's some singed barbecue, yeah, or deep freeze, big ice cube.
So it's like there's so many crazy intangibles that are going on here. Even oxygen, just this exact 21% of the elements that's needed for humans to survive. There's so many things that need to be this precise, or we're not existing. It's hostile to life. We cease to exist. And so it definitely points, as you were saying earlier, not only is this design, it's got to be intelligent design. And I guess it can be that's on a super intellectual, technical level, but you can just go as simple as just saying, look, we could walk across a beach. We could see in the sand, Tom loves Sally, written in the sand. I think overwhelming, the natural response should not be, well, that just formed by the waves. It just made these lines and all connected to create just accident. And
the sand was having a creative afternoon.
Yeah.
wanted to make some letters.
I mean, and so that's what's so beautiful about this argument. The odds for it to just be by chance or accident, it is absolute insanity. It would be like, and this is not even the greatest example, but it's a beautiful example. I think Cliff Connectley brought it up lots of times. If the three of us are sitting around at a poker table and I'm the dealer and I deal myself, we play 20 games, 20 times in a row, I deal myself a royal flush. You're not going to come to the conclusion that, just luck. That's just the way the cards went. No, you're going to reach for your gun. And if there's real money on the table, you're going to reach for your gun. And I want my money back. Like no one thinks like that. Nobody says,
gotta keep that revolver ready.
Well, that was just an impressive accident of 20 royal flushes being dealt in a row. And that's even crazier odds than that analogy. And so I think the fine tuning, the design, it's becoming more and more attractive to me personally.